good afternoon to everyone joining us today from different timelines for this policy roundtable. My name is Gaurav Saini, and I work as the lead of policy and partnerships at the for Strategic and Defense Research, New Delhi. I will be your host today, and I'm delighted to welcome you all for this policy roundtable on India's counter-terror response. Before the chair introduces the theme for this roundtable, let me introduce the distinguished panelists for today's discussion. We have with us Ambassador Latha Reddy. Ambassador Reddy is the co-chair of the Global Commission on Stability of Cyberspace. She served in the Indian Foreign Service from 1975 to 2011. She was the ambassador of India to Portugal, to Thailand. She was a secretary east in the Ministry of External Affairs in Delhi from 2010 to 2011, with overall charge of India's bilateral and regional relations with Asia. She was then appointed as India's Deputy National Security Advisor in the Prime Minister's office from 2011 to 2013. She has expertise on security and strategic issues and has worked on strategic technology policies, particularly on cyber issues relating to cybersecurity policy, international cyber cooperation, and internet governance. We also have Mr. Jayant Chaudhary with us. He's a 1978 batch IPS officer of the Assam Meghalaya cadre. He served in the Intelligence Bureau, his last assignment being its additional director. He retired as DG of the National Security Guard. During his tenure, he handled many high-profile cases. He headed the Black Cat Commando Force that renders counter-terror, counter-hijack, and VVIP security tasks. We have with us Mr. Krishan Verma. Mr. Krishan Verma is a former director of the Aviation Research Center and former Special Secretary to the Government of India Cabinet Secretariat. His areas of specialization are China, the Far East, Korea, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific and Indian Ocean region. He has practical experience in dealing with multifaceted security challenges and international terrorism. We also have with us Kabir Taneja. Kabir is a fellow with Strategic Studies Program at ORF. His research focuses on India's relations with West Asia, specifically looking at domestic political dynamics, terrorism, non-state militant actors, and the general security paradigm of the region. He has written extensively in the New York Times, the Hindu, the Huffington Post, Politico, Quartz, The Wire, etc. And finally, to steer this roundtable, we have Lieutenant General D.S. Huda, the former Northern Army Commander, Indian Army, and co-founder of CSTR. Before I hand over the proceedings of today's roundtable discussion to the chair, I would like to make a few housekeeping announcements. So each expert will have 12 to 14 minutes for their opening remarks, after which we'll move into the Q&A section and a discussion section. After we've heard from all the panelists, that's when the chair will open the floor to audience. To raise a question, participants can type their questions and queries in the Q&A box, which should be at the bottom of your Zoom window. Please mention who your query is addressed to. Alternatively, you can click the raise hand icon, and I will bring you on the screen during the Q&A round. With this, let me hand over to Lieutenant General Huda to take the discussion from here on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gaurav. Let me at the outset say it's a great privilege, to be chairing this session with such outstanding experts, and I'm sure we'll have good round of discussions today. So just to set the stage, let me start by saying that India is no stranger to terrorism. As per the Global Terrorism Index, in the first decade of this century, 21st century, we were in the top 3 countries most affected by terrorism. The last 5 years, our rank has come down to number 8. But again, among the top 10 countries affected by terror-related violence. But notwithstanding this, this data and facts and figures put out by the Global Terrorism Index, I think it would be fair to say that we have been quite successful in controlling terror-related violence in the country. So if you look back at the last 20 years, for example, terror-related deaths in the country have fallen to 10% of what they were, in 2000, 2001. But the question, I think the real question before us is that when we look at our comprehensive counterterrorism strategy, should we give primacy to control of violence as the main aspect in crafting a strategy for counterterrorism? So what should be our comprehensive approach? Should we look at other aspects? And an approach that starts out by looking at conditions that are conducive to the spread of terrorism. Should that be the first thing that we look at? Uh, Conditions that enable spread of radicalization, that enable extremism to spread in the country, polarizing and divisive narratives, particularly which are spread on the social media. What are the government's own efforts to address alienation, ethnic angst among the people of India? Uh, and again, also very important, and I think Ambassador Reddy is going to talk about this, how to counter the battle of the narratives, particularly over the digital space, and how well we are doing that. Uh, uh, I think a comprehensive counterterrorism approach also looks at various other things. The legal framework that exists in the country, the laws that are there to counter terrorism, how do you handle terror finances, issues of border management, capacity building of the police, of the security forces, of the intelligence agencies. What are our rehabilitation policies, for example, for surrendered terrorists? Uh, how do we handle victims of terrorism? So all these then can be combined together to form a national counterterrorism strategy, call it a counterterrorism approach that the nation adopts. And the overarching principle when we are adopting this approach is that the CT strategy that is adopted must have respect for human rights. It must have respect for rule of law. I mean, that's the overarching principle, when a counterterrorism strategy or a counterterrorism approach is adopted. So how today we will discuss, what the Indian strategy is, how well they are doing. Are there any shortfalls in the strategy that need to be looked at? And the various aspects, as I mentioned, about capability building, border management, legal issues, rehabilitation policies, etc. I think one more important aspect is while it's fine to have a strategy, I think there must be a system of feedback uh, in which we are able to assess correctly whether we are succeeding or not. I think that's again critical. Uh, what are the set of metrics that we adopt that define our success or failure? And I'm raising this issue, for example, Jammu and Kashmir, when we talk about it, if you talk to five different people, somebody will say things are getting better. Somebody will say, no, things are not getting better. Things are actually getting worse. And why do we come to these differing conclusions is because different people are adopting different sets of metrics to gauge whether we have succeeded or we have not succeeded. And so I think it's important after we formulated the strategy in its implementation that we are able to correctly assess success or failure of that strategy. And the third thing I think that we need to look at is whether we have adequate structures in place, organizational structures, uh, that permit us to successfully conduct our counterterrorism strategy. And are such structures in place? And so you could look at examples of states where there has been violence, Assam, Jammu and Kashmir, for example, and look at the organizational structures, uh, different agencies working under different ministries. So you have the police, which is under the state government or under the lieutenant governor of the union territory. You have the Central Armed Police Force, which are under the MHA, though when they come into the state, to some extent, they work under the state police. You have the intelligence agencies working under the Ministry of Home Affairs, where the army is the lead for counter-terror operations. Like in Jammu and Kashmir, we have the Rashtra Rifle Battalions. Uh, they work under the Ministry of Defense. So is there a unified sort of structure and organization required? And I know we have a unified headquarter system in place, but is it completely appropriate? Is it able to actually do and adopt a unified plan so that you know CT operations can be successfully executed? So these are some issues I think that we will talk about. And finally, with India's entry into the United Nations Security Council, it will also be chairing the Counterterrorism Committee. And so, is there some scope here to align sort of international practices? The United Nations has an Office of Counterterrorism. Uh, can India sort of influence some areas there so that we have a more comprehensive sort of global counterterrorism strategy that is adopted? Is there scope for regional organizations like the BRICS or the Quad to play a role in transnational terrorism, particularly? So, as I said, some of these areas we will cover during our discussion. I will now call on the panelists to give their opening remarks. Um, we'll start by with Mr. Chaudhary, then Ambassador Reddy, Mr. Kishan Verma, and finally Kabir. And what we'll do is, after you have finished giving your opening remarks, if there are some areas where we think that some more additional discussion is required, or some areas that have been left out, we can spend the next 30 to maybe 20-30 minutes with the panelists discussing those areas. And finally, the last say 45 minutes, we'll open it up for Q&A. So may I request Mr. Jayantu Chaudhary to please start the proceedings.
General Huda, my fellow panelists, and those who are participating in today's today's webinar. General Huda has outlined the framework, and I, on my part, based on the experiences that I have had, I will focus on three areas. One is about the India's anti-terror laws. How are they performing? How can they be? Is there a case for them to be strengthened? The second is what policies are in place to engage with and rehabilitate former members of terror outfits. And finally, and I think this is something many of us will give our views on, where does India's city strategy fall short, if at all? So first about the anti-terror laws. Now, there is always a debate on whether you need anti-terror laws, whether they infringe on human rights. But most societies, even liberal societies like the US and the UK, do have special laws in place. And in India, law commissions have repeatedly recommended the need for a separate legal framework to deal with terrorist acts, acknowledging that this is a different category of crime and perhaps requires a different framework. Now, in India, we have had earlier, we've had the Terrorist Activities Disruption Act, then we had the Prevention of Terrorism Act, and today, most cases are being dealt with under the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. There are some other acts as well, such as the National Security Act, which are used infrequently, but today it is mainly the UAPA, and especially after the recent amendments, it is seen as the strongest lever in the hands of the law enforcement agencies, in the hands of the state, to deal with terror. Now, the more special laws, they kind of address the following issues. One, they define the ingredients that constitute a terror offense. You may all recall that the Supreme Court held that the Rajiv Gandhi assassination uh, could not fall under the sections of TADA, because they said it didn't meet the ingredients of a terror act. So defining a terrorist act is the first requirement of a terror law, and the UAPA does that quite comprehensively, and in fact, some critics say that it's maybe too comprehensively. So far as the law enforcement agencies are concerned, they always look for ways in which they can effectively deal with a terror offense. Earlier, there were as you probably recall, the TADA had provisions such as confessions to a police officer of designated rank being admissible in court, because otherwise it was seen that getting witness statements were very difficult. And then there were some other provisions like being found with a weapon or explosives in designated or non-designated areas, that automatically the burden of proof was on the accused in that case. So these are issues that, so far as the law enforcement agencies are concerned, they are fighting a very difficult battle, and they would obviously want whatever tools they need uh, to make them more effective. Now, so far as the way it is operating is today, so the if you have when you look at the National Investigation Agency (NIA), they seem to be doing a pretty good job. They have almost an 80% proportion of cases charge sheeted, and they have a conviction rate of almost 90% in their special courts. But otherwise, at the state level, it doesn't seem to be that effective, and uh, you have uh, you have trials going on for years, and it's even the conviction rate is much lower. Now, how can 80 laws be strengthened? As I mentioned, the first is whether it could the confession before a police officer could once again be considered. The Supreme Court has held that the concerns or apprehensions of abuse are not enough to negate this required provision. And in any case, Section 25 of the Evidence Act, which does not allow confessions before a police officer to be admissible, perhaps India is the only country where we have this kind of a restriction. Similarly, a more liberal approach to admissibility of evidence obtained through electronic or other means would help, because again, this is a very, very different category, and and obtaining evidence is really a challenge. Then this is something that has been debated but has never really been done effectively: the witness protection. Usually, the witnesses are intimidated, and it's very difficult. Most of them, they kind of turn hostile, and it's very, very difficult to over a sustained period to ensure that the witnesses remain for the prosecution. Now, preventive detention is something that the NSA has, but not the UAPA. Now, and that is something that would also be of help. Now, the alternative, if you don't have effective terror laws, what's happening and what has happened in many states is extrajudicial actions, which are certainly uh, not desirable, and in no society can tolerate such things. So, if we need an effective counter-terror capability, we have to give our law enforcement agencies the tools that they need. Of course, there must be a robust review mechanism. There must be a robust review mechanism. There's no doubt about it. And right now, UAPA, there's a review mechanism headed by a High Court judge usually. And if that is not enough, anything else can be considered. But the fact that there are instances of abuse is not enough to do away with it. Now, we must also keep in mind that it's not just the investigation capacity for investigation or fast track courts. The weakest link in the entire justice system that addresses terror acts is corrections. Now, some states do have special jails, but you just build special jails and you look at the security part of it. But so far as the the influencing the behavior is concerned, we really do not have effective framework. In some states, they have tried de-radicalization, they have tried other means, but it's certainly not effective enough as of now. And finally, with regard to this subject, is keeping under trial accused, for terrorist actions along with other under trial prisoners is a recipe for recruitment of minor criminals into terrorist acts. It's happened time and again that they are recruited in the jails. So these are some of the issues, and I think I'm talking to an informed audience here. So I these are issues that I highlight. There are those who are in favor of these, and there are those who are against such stringent measures. But I have given the view from those from the law enforcement point of view, who have to deal with terror activities. The second area I'd like to talk about is policies in place to engage with and rehabilitate former members of terror outfits. Now, of course, in the Northeast, right from the Shillong Accord, they were rehabilitated in BSF battalions. But in Assam, particularly, the first wave of surrenders that took place in the early 90s, there was no formal policy, but they were given a lot by the government. They were given liquor licenses. Many of them were given large tracts of government land. And of course, some of them set up informal mafias and took control of the coal trade and other things. And more or less a blind eye was turned towards them. So they all became quite wealthy people. But formal policies came in 1998. And these kind of the main components of this policy was: number one, they were given some kind of a stipend. They were given a grant that was used that was put in fixed deposits that could be used as money for to buy auto rickshaws and so on. And there was maintenance expenditure given for the camps. Now, and they were of course given vocational training. Now I remember a top Alpha leader. He told me that since the age of 18, all I've known are guns and violence. And now you want to train me to be a plumber. So there's a bit of a mismatch in the kind of experience that they have had in this world of violence and what we offer them in these rehabilitation packages. Now, the other thing is, when they surrender in groups, we have to be very clear. Do we expect the leaders to continue to retain their hold on the cadres to facilitate the rehabilitation process or not? Now, I remember in Assam, there was an issue that they felt that the leaders were not giving the full amount to the cadres. So they started sending the amounts directly to individual bank accounts of each cadre. Then the leaders said, in that case, we don't have control. So these are issues that seem to be on, when you look at it on paper, it seems that's something you need to do. But if you look at the structure and the experience of those who have worked in these extremist organizations, it has a different implication. Now, what actually works? Again, I think each area will have its own needs. I remember in Bengal, when the Maoist actions took place from 2008 to 2011, of course, a lot of work was done by the police and both the state police and the CRPF. But the final killing blow was when the government created 10,000 posts of junior constables in the 3 districts that were affected. When you look at 10,000 posts, you're looking at actually 50 to 60,000 people who are benefited, if you look at the families. So that actually broke the back. So these are issues that have to be considered. Again, the other way, those who remember the Ikhwanul Muslimin in J&K with Kuka Pare, that goes in a different way. So very often when you try to bring them into the force, but don't bring them into a rigorous the discipline of an armed force, you have a problem. It happens everywhere. The last is about India's city strategy. Where does it fall short, if at all? Now, time after time, post-incident reviews, both in India and in other countries, indicates that inputs are available before an accident, before an incident, but the failure is in connecting the dots. If you read the Pradhan Committee report after 26/11, it says the same thing. It says individual reports warning of an attack, and from the seaward side in Mumbai were available. The Mumbai police took follow-up action, but somehow the prevention or quick response was not there. Now, where is this gap between sharing of intelligence inputs and the last mile action to prevent or effectively respond? Today, so far as intelligence sharing and evaluation is concerned, we have the multi-agency center at the national level. We have the state multi-agency center at the states, and they meet regularly and sometimes almost on a daily basis. You have a threat management system. You have NatGrid that helps to connect uh, law enforcement agencies to data providers. You have a cell to prevent financial support to terrorism. So all these have been thought of. Structures have been put in place, but I think we are still, as General Huda had mentioned, there's been a lot of there's been a lot of I think a lot of achievement in containing violence. But if you have to look at a broader picture, perhaps it's still an ongoing process. Now, each conflict area needs a different approach. And as General Huda had mentioned, the fact that violence levels have dropped indicate only to an extent that the strategy has been effective. If you still have 100, if you still have large deployments of forces, how realistic is it to say that you've achieved normality? Now, so far as the says, if you look at the left wing, you have a national action plan, and that tries to bring in the different components, whether it's development, good governance, and of course the armed capability. If you look at the Northeast, you have a similar approach. So these have contained violence. In the Northeast, violence is at very low levels. Today, most violence in the left-wing extremist areas are confined to Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh. And similarly, even Jammu Kashmir, if you look at compared to what it was in the early years of this century, there's been a marked drop in violence. But the question was well raised: is this the only metric of success? I mean, is it like the GDP of a country, where you say that our GDP is growing, but income inequality remains wide? So, if I have to talk about weaknesses or areas where more effort is needed, I'd say a lack of research and development in the different areas. I'd also talk about the um, the um, the lack of understanding of the human terrain in different areas. You have large central forces who come and then they go, but there's not enough capability built up at the state level to understand the human terrain. Similarly, there's a need to strengthen the capability of police stations. You create armed forces both at the state level and the center. You have you have every state has special weapons and tactics teams today. Maharashtra has Force One. Then you have the Greyhounds. You have the Octopus at the state level. You have the National Security Guard. You have the Cobras of the CRPF. But the police station itself, while you made schemes that provide fortification and infrastructure, little has been done to improve the human capabilities. Similarly, I would say that engaging communities is an area where much more effort is needed. No, I'm not just talking about civic action plans or special police officers, but finding ways, as was said, to convince them of your narrative. Now, last thing I talk about is going beyond our borders. In the Northeast, I think enlisting the support of Bhutan, Bangladesh, and Myanmar had a significant role in containing militancy. Now, the other end, I think in the near future, it's I think it's desirable, but not sure whether uh, Pakistan occupied Kashmir, whether we would have similar success in denying the use of those areas as sanctuaries for groups that choose to attack India. So other means have been used, such as the Financial Action Task Force and other UN agencies, so that pressure can be can be applied. Now, this is a very wide area, and these are just some of the issues that I thought to bring up in these three. I would welcome any questions on on these particular these three areas. That's all from my side, General Huda.
Yeah,
Oh, sorry,
I just,
sorry, back.
yeah, I just the electricity went off for a while, so I'll just switch off my audio. Sorry, video. Okay. So thank you very much, Mr. Chaudhary. You talked about the laws and how unless we have effective laws, you could see the security forces resorting to extrajudicial action, which is something that happens when there is a level of frustration that legally we will not be able to enforce these things. You made some very relevant points about rehabilitation. Uh, my own personal experience and what you said is quite right. I think we need to look at these, based on what our local conditions are. I recall, a surrender policy for those terrorists who had gone across into Pakistan occupied Kashmir and wanted to come back. And the surrender policy stated that they can only come back through designated routes like the Wagah border or through the Indira Gandhi International Airport. Now, obviously, these were routes that were not acceptable or could not be used by those terrorists. So their move across the line of control, was not a part of the policy, and therefore, to a large extent, the failure of that policy was, because of this. And finally, you talked about, where the shortfalls are. Um, After all have spoken, Mr. Chaudhary, I would like to hear your views on what we can do as far as de-radicalization is concerned, because you raised that issue about radicalization and de-radicalization measures, and if there are some sort of success stories that you have of measures that have been taken, we'd love to hear from you. I'll now call on Ambassador Lata Reddy. Ma'am, could you please give your opening remarks?
Thank you so much, General Huda, and greetings to my fellow panelists. And I would like to put this, firstly, let me clarify that I'll be addressing one specific question, which was put to us as a group. That is, how does India check the use of ICT by terrorist organizations and individuals? Um, I would like to treat this in three sections. The first would be the international context. The second would be the Indian situation. And the third would be the solutions. I do realize that our emphasis has to be on the Indian situation, where the use of ICT by terrorist groups and individuals is concerned. But I feel it's important to put it in the international context as well, because as we all know, cyberspace is a borderless domain. And unless there is some international cooperation, we cannot hope to check it completely in the domestic context. Let me begin by saying that terrorists are children of their time. Like all of us, they too use modern technology, not just for innocuous acts like using their apps, their browsers. They also use it for heinous acts like planning murderous attacks on people and on institutions. What are the signals we need to watch for globally for terrorism in the age of technology? Essentially, most terrorist attacks in the past used to be by what I call low technology means. Bombs, mass shootings, using cars, vans, guns, and even knives. These were traditionally the way terrorist attacks used to take place. Al-Qaeda and IS have on numerous occasions urged their followers to keep the attacks simple, because that was essentially what they felt was most effective. But recently, there have been a lot of worries about the use of new technologies and terrorist threats emanating from these new technologies. We've heard talk of robots, automated weapon systems, drones, 3D printing of guns and other lethal weapons. And all these are seen as a great threat through the use of artificial intelligence and accelerated new technologies to how terrorists operate in the future. In cyber attacks, certainly the automated tasks carried out by using AI tools will make the scale and impact of the attacks much larger, which aligns with the motives and incentives of terror groups. But overall, I still believe that terrorists largely use conventional methods. The real danger is in the future, and we have to anticipate that and work towards that. For example, fragile states can buy AI technologies, and when these states collapse, these technologies can easily fall into the hands of terror groups or undesirable elements. And the use of the internet has so far, I would say, by terror groups been used more for propaganda, communications, and they've used a lot of the anonymous fora, like what we call the dark web. And anon is actually a noun used to describe a person who uses anonymous and no rules fora, like, for instance, 8chan. Public certainly knows about these forums, particularly the interested public, which in this case would be the terrorist groups. People with extremist views, mass shooters use this fora, announce attacks there, and the use of and role of such fora, we will really need to monitor and track these. I have had discussions with our colleagues in Interpol who deal with cyber attacks, the offices in Singapore. And one of our own former police officers, Madan Oberoi, is now currently directing this office. And he has done very exhaustive work on the dark web and what needs to be tracked there. And I believe our experts should be in constant touch with this Interpol office. I'm sure they are, in order to take advantage of their expertise and to implement those systems into our own. What is the difference between these anonymous sites or anonymous fora and the dark web and legitimate sites which we use. There's absolutely no moderation efforts in these groups that I'm referring to, the 8chan, the anonymous groups. The users are totally anonymous. There's no need to register or create an account, so it makes it very difficult to track them. In mainstream fora, you certainly have to do that. So therefore, there's potential for, there are both potential and actual operating terrorists expressing themselves very freely in this fora. And they really do want to inspire and incite violence, and they do succeed. What we really need to combat this, both globally and in India, is public-private partnerships to counter terrorist and extreme violent online content. Technical expertise is not necessarily very prevalent in the counterterrorism professionals, because they are looking more at the traditional forms of terrorism. So governments need to work with technology teams, hacker groups, and private sector companies. Otherwise, you can't really put together an effective deterrent for these groups. We need to use our brightest and our best. We need to use the access frameworks also of mainstream private communications and social media companies who have enormous data resources, access, and they can also identify these individuals whom we want to track. A good example of how the world reacted to a terrorist threat or an attack was the Christchurch Call to Action Summit. Governments, leading technology firms agreed to cooperate, and many others, organizations, agreed to cooperate on eliminating terrorism and extremist content online while taking into account freedom of expression. The problem really is, how do you involve small technology companies in this exercise? Involving the major companies is easy. Terrorists, as I said, groups like 8chan or a small company with anonymous sharing portals like justpaste.it were used by IS to distribute information even on military matters. Such companies will not cooperate with governments or with law enforcement agencies. So this is the conundrum. Now we move to cyber terrorism in India, which I said would be the second area that I would concentrate on. With India's growing e-governance and digital connectivity, online warfare and cyber attacks are certainly increasing. China and Pakistan remain essentially very active players in this area. There are also hacker groups, there are cybercrime groups, and there are fraud and ransomware attacks by these groups. As Mr. Chaudhary said, I think it's important to also take into account what framework currently exists in India for dealing with cyber terrorism. I would say the IT Act of 2000, the Information Technology Act, as amended in 2008, still gives us the root law that can be applied to deal with cyber issues. Specifically, Section 66F, 70, 70A, 70B of the IT Act relate to cybersecurity in India. And critical information infrastructure is covered by Section 70. And 70A actually envisages the creation of an organization for protecting CII, or critical information infrastructure, which in fact has been implemented. Hacking, phishing, ID fraud, and electronic theft have all been addressed in these different sections. There are also the information and technology rules, or the CT-IN rules of 2013. and other regulations which do exist. But the real question is, if you combine the traditional cyber threats, traditional threats and cyber threats in terrorism, uh, it can have pretty lethal effects. What are the risks? The risks, I would say, are health and emergency systems networks, as we saw recently with the attacks on certain healthcare systems, Dr. Reddy's labs and others. uh, it is possible to really distort and attack health data, which is of vital importance, not just to the company involved, but to the health of the millions of people whose data that company may hold. The second risk area is economic, where digital companies or companies using digital networks can be severely attacked and damaged. The domestic attacks will then have global implications. So again, we come back to the international versus the domestic. In cyber, it's very difficult to separate the two. The fourth risk I would see would be the huge growth that we have today in the world in hacker numbers. And in some cases, these groups of hackers are in fact supported by nation states. And finally, the reputational damages to those institutions which are attacked by cyber attacks. Now, which are the groups who traditionally undertake attacks? I would say, firstly, organized crime. The second is what I call hacktivism, where people want to prove a point or espouse their cause by showing that they can attack a particular institution or government or country. The third is non-state terror groups, which is, of course, the most dangerous. The fourth is the lone wolf attacks, where people hack for the sake of hacking, but can do untold damage in the process. And finally, you have the nation states themselves who may be behind certain attacks. Why is international cooperation been so limited in spite of our many efforts? Firstly, nations disagree on how international law applies to online operations. Secondly, there are severe geopolitical tensions, as we all know, between the major players at this time. Thirdly, there's a lack of resources for most countries to build capabilities in this area. Fourthly, there's a resistance to norms and regulations from many countries. And accountability is very difficult and hard to prove for many countries that do not have sophisticated tools. But I would say the overriding problem really in building international cooperation on this, including for India, has been a lack of trust. You know, we are somewhat hesitant to go into alliances or partnerships with many countries. And this obviously blocks any kind of international agreement. But I will come to it in the solutions. There is a solution to this. You know, internet has certainly emerged as an important hub for terrorism. There, as I said, propaganda, recruitment, radicalization, incitement to terrorism, also financing, very, very important, financing of terrorist activities. A lot of it goes on the dark web. Training and planning of terror attacks. And there's a great need to combat this. And, you know, we certainly don't want cyber attackers breaking into government and critical information servers, nor do we want them to disable our military, financial, or service sectors. And the more connected a country becomes, and that's the path India is on, the more vulnerable we will be to attacks. Why was Estonia attacked? Because it was almost totally digital at that time. So it literally brought the country to a grinding halt. So finally, we've seen many attacks in the past. You know, we've seen regular terrorist attacks. We've seen these new kind of terrorist attacks. We've seen 9/11 in the US. We've seen 26/11 in our own country. We've seen WannaCry and NetPetya, which were global attacks. They all use some form of technology, ranging from sophisticated cyber attacks and cyber tools and artificial intelligence to the use of mobile VoIP and computers, which is what I would call simple technologies. Now, I'll come to the final part, because I always believe we shouldn't just talk about the problems, we must give some solutions. To me, the most important solution would be to build an effective counter narrative online, and I'll come back to that. But the other solutions which I would suggest is, one is we need to build norms and implement agreed norms, both domestically and in the international sphere. India must commit itself to this process of how do you build peace and security into cyberspace. Secondly, we need to strengthen our own national network and our own national efforts on ICT security. Thirdly, we need innovation in technology, but we must also be aware of the risks and try for the policies to keep pace with the growth in these technologies. Next, we need to create trusted international partnerships. And this is what I was referring to when I said there is a solution. We may not have international agreement across the board, but we can bring in trusted international partners and benefit from their knowledge and their own networks to build ours better. We create a multi-stakeholder cyber defense system where we bring in all the players, the private sector, the experts. We create better insurance systems to protect our industries and the private sector from technology attacks. We go in for really good capacity building in terms of training and education. We build in safeguards into any hardware and software that we are creating in India for our own use. And we educate all users. Now, coming to the first item I mentioned, which is the counter narrative policy, which I believe we need to develop. How do you create a counter narrative policy? First, you have to challenge what is being said by the terrorist groups, and you have to give an alternative. Secondly, you have to deconstruct, discredit, and demystify terrorist messages. Thirdly, we have to be reactive and confrontational. You have to take it head on. It's not a question of just saying, well, there's this story and there's my story. You have to say that story is wrong. This is the correct picture. The next one is targeted approaches. You have to target the message to your audience. The message you put out about incidents in J&K may be different from the messages you put out on incidents in the Maoist areas or in the Northeast. And you must use government strategic communications as well, to reinforce the points. It's very, very important to bring in communications experts and create credible organizations through which you can send out these counter narratives, because otherwise it'll just be dismissed as government propaganda. It has to be a viable and credible organization. And this will then be trusted by the public. You have to work with reputed civil society agencies, private companies, and individuals. And this will increase the confidence in these counter narratives. So I hope I've given you a bird's eye view of the problems in this area, in the international context, our own domestic context, and in possible solutions for the future. Thank you. You have to unmute yourself, General Huda.
General Huda.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Ambassador Reddy. You've covered a lot of ground and with great clarity. Outlined clearly what the threads are. You've also outlined, our approach, public-private partnership, how we need international cooperation. And I think very interestingly covered also what our counter-narrative policy should be for, areas where there are internal conflicts, because I think this is one area where, the government strategy is slightly weak. I think when we go into the Q&A, one crucial issue we could also look at, you mentioned it in passing, is, how to control extremist content on social media, and how easy or difficult is it, and are we doing enough to be able to work in that direction? So thank you very much, ma'am, and may I now request Mr. Krishan Verma, please.
So thank you, General Huda. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to this panel and a distinguished set of panelists. I think the groundwork has been very well laid in terms of the laws that are enforced for a counterterrorism strategy. I think Jayanto has very eloquently brought out all those. So I'm not going to get into that at all. But maybe perhaps during the course of my presentation and maybe in the Q&A, we could actually look at the implementation aspect and the success of that. And as you mentioned in your opening remarks, what kind of matrices can be put into place to be able to quantify, as well as look at the qualitative aspect of this quantification of results. And I think Ambassador Reddy, of course, has most vividly brought out the role of technology and the solutions, the problems, the solutions, the challenges that face us in this area. So I'm going to really not touch these subjects at all, but make just a quick mention about technology. I will spend just about a minute on, and then go into the counter-terrorism narratives, what is happening in the international sphere, which she alluded to. But let me give a few specific examples of what we are seeing in different, whether it's a convention, comprehensive convention of on international terrorism, or what BRICS is doing, what Quad is doing, what's happening in the other areas. And also then come down to some specific areas, and especially I think, while I won't go into the Northeast, which I consider more an insurgency and militancy prone, but I'll go into the terrorism aspect, which we are seeing more of in J&K. And what we could do, what are the perceptions and what we could do about them. That's going to be what I will focus on, at least in the opening remarks. So coming straight into the technology aspect of what Ambassador Reddy had put out, I think there is a definite area of study, and I don't think we have done enough on actually going into machine learning or deep machine learning or the use of AI, robotics at the same level that we should be doing it. I think there are some areas of neural networks which we really need to delve into, we really need to dive into, and whether you're looking at different techniques of 5-layer neural networks, or you're looking at SVMs, or you're looking at the the Naive Bayes formula. There are different things which are out there in the internet domain for people to really look at and see how we could really go into the dark web or go into other sites, chat groups, etc., and see what is playing out in those areas, and then develop a counter narrative as to how to neutralize these, if not completely overwrite them. At least let's see how much we can eliminate, how much we can mitigate this kind of damage that is being done out of these, the use of the network and the ICT. So that's as far as that area was concerned. In the international cooperation, which was also touched upon, I think we really need to look at the CCIT and what has the CCIT achieved? What are the issues and problems? So I'm going to spend just a minute or two just to, it's a broad brush kind of a thing, so that we're able to, I don't really want to tick the box, but let's visit that area. So CCIT, I'm not going to the history of it, but what we are looking at is that there is obviously some sort of a reluctance on the part of countries which are members of the UN to give a unified or universal definition to counterterrorism. They're not willing to define terror for their own reasons, and those reasons can vary from the US because they would like to use force even in peacetime environments, And therefore, that could be an act of terrorism in a way. So they don't want this definition to be brought out. We have the Organization of Islamic countries, which have a different way of looking at it. I think they are looking at countries which are really looking at, their freedom movements or the Israeli-Palestinian conflicts. They don't want the definition to be brought out in black and white. The Latin American countries have a different way of looking at it. We have a different way of looking at it. And even though we were sponsors of this 96 initiative, it hasn't really got off the ground because of the reasons that there are different perceptions at different points of time, and people have their own nationalist views. And I think it's fair enough. So there is an attempt to bring this to the table as we are going into more and more terrorist activities in the world. But I think it's a little far away to be able to get 193 countries on board to be able to come out with a unified or universal definition of terrorism. So as rightly brought out by Ambassador Reddy, I think we are looking more at international cooperation. And those international cooperation, I was looking at various models that have been brought out by different groups of countries. And I think the one which I found most robust was the BRICS. And the BRICS, the definition that they have done in last year, November, was really far-reaching. They actually address every aspect of terrorism and counterterrorism to fight that scourge. It talks about cooperation. It talks about working together to plan, to go after terrorists, to be able to identify them, to neutralize them, and to, if possible, to be able to bring them down to just neutralization or elimination, in fact. So I think that is a very robust document. And what I found from the conclusions that were arrived at that particular meeting was that the High Representatives had decided to have a counterterrorism working group, which is going to go into a plan of not only somehow giving more content to the definitions that had been given and the areas of coverage of counterterrorism, but also bring out a plan for implementation, an action plan. It could be in the making, it might take time. I think it's a very important group, because if you really look at Brazil and Russia, India, China, and South Africa, you're covering so much of the world, and so many areas which are actually bedeviled by the scourge of terrorism. So I think that's an important group. The other one which was developing, and I think we have a tremendous amount of interest in, is the Quad. And I've been a great proponent personally about the Quad and a Quad Plus kind of a configuration for various things in terms of security architecture, especially which could be best for our interests and the least conflicting. BRICS can have a lot of counter currents coming from different participants and constituents, but the Quad, I think, is basically a better forum, at least as far as we are concerned, for interagency consultation, for exchange of intelligence, for information sharing, and perhaps after a degree of maturity and political understanding, as well as capability and capacity development, we might be able to work together on countering terrorism, which comes in different parts of the region, especially in the Indo-Pacific and extensions. There have been many examples where there have been tip-offs by friendly agencies about developments that are happening. I think 2611 was a case in point where we got information both from the US and the Israelis that something was happening. But as mentioned some time ago, we really didn't connect the dots and didn't follow up on some of the information, and that is a difficulty coming in from the background that I did, and Jainto spent a lot of time in. It's you're sort of sometimes flooded with so much information. It's really very difficult to be able to sieve out just the right kind of gem that you're looking for, which could actually change a terrorist attack. And we were almost on top of it in Sri Lanka. If you remember the church bombings, we had given information. It was a pinpointed information, as close as you can get. But the agency there couldn't really stop that attack from happening because of various issues, and that was also mentioned some time ago about people working in silos. There are vertical exchanges of information, not so much of lateral and horizontal flow of information, and then coordination, and then questions of one-upmanship, who goes first to report, and who takes action, etc. So there are lots of difficulties, practical difficulties in the implementation of solutions, which we all are quite well aware of, but sometimes hesitate to take, or sometimes the incidents overcome our ability to act on time. So Quad, actually, I must admit that I didn't see very much coming out after the initial exercise, which was a tabletop exercise, which was piloted by the NIA in November 2019, which was, I think, a pretty impressive attempt at not only validating different ways of countering terrorism, but also assessing what can be done, what are the kind of threats, and how they should be able to tackle them in an informal group like a quadrilateral security dialogue. I think it was a very impressive, very interesting initiative that was taken up. I think it is functioning in many ways. Past experience does tell me that there is a lot of intelligence sharing, and there's a lot of actionable intelligence, which is shared between the agencies, and action is being taken both in the internal and external spheres. Moving on from international cooperation, let me spend a little time about on J&K, the counterterrorism narratives that are there. What could be done? How do we tackle them? Are we doing enough? Are some of the questions that were brought out in the flyer when we were invited for this conference? And let me try and attempt to answer some of those issues. You know, I think especially in the J&K, there is what begins to happen and where's the pitch for us is a trust deficit. Somehow, right or wrong, the people, the ordinary person in the valley, just believes that we are not doing everything for their good. It's a challengeable and it's obviously quite wrong. I think a lot has been done towards that, but there's external influence which is interfering in the efforts that the government is making, whether it's administrative, whether it's political, whether it's economic, and also socio-political, as well as some civil society efforts that are going in to tell them or alleviate the sufferings, the perception that they have that they are somehow discriminated against or not treated at par with other citizens, or the way they expect to be treated as per the whether you look at it from a political science angle or from any other dimension. So I think this is something that really needs to be addressed. My own opinion is that I think we really need to look at some of these acts which are there. There is, I think, of course, the Armed Forces Special Powers Act is there. Perhaps if there's a time for appraising its or reviewing its applicability in the entire state, perhaps we could actually restrict it or limit it to certain areas which are prone to and affected by militancy and high degree of terrorism. This is a narrative where it comes from. We ourselves bring out statistics from time to time about the average militant presence in the valley, to about 250 to 300 armed guys. And that, if that be true, and we are looking at the southern districts of J&K, which are actually afflicted by this scourge, then we need to really look at whether you really need to bring the entire state into this, and isn't there some regulations that we could bring it, certain other controls that we could bring to show a sense of normalcy to the others, and actually just go after in a very pointed, very, very measured and a very direct fashion, again, at the root of these people who are creating disturbances for us. That's the first thing I thought we could look at. The other thing was, and this is in a more contemporary context, we've had some inclement weather. There's been a snowfall which was unprecedentedly high. last 30 years. I think it was the harshest winter that they went through, and it was a very early winter in November. A lot of lives have been lost. A lot of farmers have lost their crops. So I think there is something that we really need to do over there to be able to alleviate these sufferings, and these are genuine sufferings of the people there, to be able to bring back this, or at least neutralize this trust deficit. They have been hampered by lack of communication. The internet is down. We have restored at least the 2G, and I think that's for good reason. 4G can be misused very quickly. It's too broadband medium to be allowed at this point of time. So, one is doing a phased kind of opening up in that region, but perhaps that could be looked into so that people are able to communicate openly and a little more easily. But at the same time, we'll have to bring in checks and controls about such freedoms in inverted commas being given to people, which could be misused very rapidly and cause a setback. And perhaps we must prevent it going back to violent days. I think recruitment is down, violence is down. The security forces have been able to have much more targeted attacks, and they have had many successes. So I think that is something that we really need to hold from a military point of view, or from a police point of view. But at the same time, we need to treat the public slightly differently from the known terrorist. And I think this is something that we really need to think over. I think it's also a very good time to look at, and this is part of the perception management, which I think is most important in a counterterrorism situation, and especially in the J&K. We need to be able to direct the narrative, control the narrative, and give our narrative. And this actually goes right across, cuts across all spectrum, whether it's the print media, the electronic media, or it is it's cyberspace. I think in all these areas, as well as much as human to human interactions, I think there is a need. And when I'm talking about human to human interactions, I would like to mention about restarting the interlocutor kind of conversations. We need to have people without any sort of political briefs, as independent people representing civil society or communities, to be able to go in and interact and actually reach out to, I would imagine, just two sections which really need to be focused on. And one would be the farmers, the rural areas. That's something that we really need to go out and talk to and try and win over, again in quotes, to our side. And the other section of polity, which I think is very, very important, is students. We need to be able to find ways to harness the energy of the youth, to try and bring them into areas other than what they are indulging in, whether it's joblessness or unemployment or whatever. We need to be able to address that, and it can't come only by putting them into jobs which they probably don't like to do, or they're not skilled enough to do it. And Jento had touched upon that. I would enforce that and say that these are very important areas. We need to find something which they are adept at, something they have the acumen and the skill, and most importantly, the interest to pursue. Two things readily come into my mind. Of course, I think we really need to look at bringing in some quality institutions in that area. People are thinking about it already, but you need to have some really top-class engineering colleges or IITs to go in there. An area which also needs a great amount of emphasis is the area of medical research as well as treatments. You need hospitals, the AIMS kind of hospitals that need to go in, nursing care, and perhaps these are areas where the local population could also be very happy to go into. I mean, I think they are very good at nursing. We've seen it in the Northeast. Their sector, that services sector, is absolutely doing very, very well. And I think we should really look at the possibility of extending this kind of vocation and skill sets into the Kashmiris. Also look at some ways of reviving their own industries, things that they've been able to do, whether it comes out of some sort of a subsidy to be able to protect their handicraft, their cultures, and to be able to preserve their livelihoods in some way within the state. Would be something that could go a long way towards addressing the counterterrorism narrative in that area. Of course, discussions, outreaches by political people is important, but I think such a discredited lot of people at this point of time, we need to be able to actually go past them and try and empower the panchayats, the blocks, the real, the grassroots level democracy, cliche, but nevertheless, that is where we need to go into self-governance and be able to reach out and give them that feeling that they could govern for themselves, and we don't need to come in from North Block and South Block and sit over them and lord over their own land and soil. I think these are some of the areas which I think would go a long way towards developing a counter-terrorist strategy and implementation, especially in the J&K. We also need to bring out in some way to the fore the subdued voices in the valley. There are a lot of people who think very well of how things are and what they should be. They want shanti, they want they want peace, they want prosperity, they want dignity more than anything else. We need to be able to bring those out and not go in for a top-down approach in actually deciding for them what is good for them. I think that feeling has to change, and even if it is changing, it's probably not percolating down into the people. A couple of things that have gone very well in terms of changed SOPs, which I noticed started coming in since last year. And I've been a great votary for this, even the times when I was in the valley and things were actually on fire in the mid-90s. Very, very troubled and very testy times. And that's the time I used to say the same thing. And I'm glad some people are talking about I saw an MHA directive the other day talking about there's no question of glorification of militants. You don't have to go to the press and media and say so-and-so is a great chap, or sometimes loosely be called a martyr, or he's been killed, or that's happened, or that. You're just feeding into the narrative of the terrorist. This is exactly what he wants. He wants sensationalism. He wants popularity. He wants to be considered a martyr when he's not. He's just a terrorist. I mean, he needs to be shot. The other thing that I saw was also a curtailment of these public funerals, shows of thousands of people gathering and going, and, matam ho raha hai, and people are banging their chests, and people are wailing and crying and creating a kind of a gust. I think this has also been curtailed to a large extent, and I think these are two very, very good steps that have happened toward developing the counter-terrorist narrative. The third is social media, which I think, again, is a very important aspect, and Ambassador Reddy had touched upon it. I think it needs to be properly watched, and we need to have, in fact, a team of people looking into this. These people have not to be only belonging to one shade or the other. We are, and I'm sure this is going to be followed by Kabir, who's an expert on de-radicalization and rehabilitation. So I'm not going to go into that area. I'm sure he's going to be able to cover it much better. But these are the kind of things we really need to look at in a very subtle way. They've got to be experts in psychology. They've got to be experts on the actual militancy, and be practitioners more than theorists and armchair specialists. We need to be able to go out in the field and use the people who've actually been there to be able to change this narrative in some way, of the paradigm of the problem. So these are some of the areas I wanted to touch, and I could come back to this later. I think I have done 15 or 20 minutes, so maybe we'll get back to this. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Mr. Verma. I think you covered areas of international cooperation and how we can sort of leverage the BRICS and even the Quad in our counterterrorism approaches and policies. And I think the suggestions that you made about J&K are very relevant. A human-centric approach, the trust deficit, how to alleviate some of the sufferings, and some suggestions that you made regarding OSPA, etc. I think they are worth considering. So now we are running way short of time. So Kabir, may I request you now?
Yeah. Thanks, General Huda. It's always difficult to speak last. So many great points have been made already. I will largely concentrate on a couple of points that have already been talked about, but also some of the work that I have done around this area and around the topic of counterterrorism. I think first and foremost, I would like to start with just sort of pushing through a ideation and a narrative that I think there needs to be a bit more wider debate on how we see terrorism in India right now. And of course, our history sort of takes our conversations towards majoritarily towards one experience, which is of course Kashmir, and that's where we have suffered the most. I think there is a need to also see transnational terror now as a separate sort of important topic, which has its own sort of idiosyncrasies. It has its own way of working now, and it has its own threat perceptions now, which may not necessarily rely on our experiences in either Kashmir or in other terror attacks that we have faced, or our counterinsurgency sort of ecosystems that we have created. So and this includes sort of evolution of groups such as Islamic State, the so-called Islamic State, or Al-Qaeda, and so on and so forth, and how they have evolved over the past couple of years, whether co-opting technologies that we use for our daily sort of usage, whether it's be encrypted apps to social media to whatever it may be, and what kind of impact that they are creating in these sort of newer ecosystems and how we should deal with them. Now, from what I have seen in the past couple of years, whether it be my field work or be the research that we have published at the Observer Research Foundation, I do believe at this point of time and at this juncture where we are, whatever we tend to do, whether it be a state's policy reaction in the CT field or in the counterterrorism field, or the center's sort of policy reaction in the counterterrorism field, we always are at least 2 steps behind than most of these actors at this point of time. Because of course, the newer terrorist, the newer sort of ways terror groups are co-opting both on how they conduct attacks, how they propagate their attacks, how they market their attacks, and how they radicalize now is much more varied and much more loose than it ever used to be. I still, just to give a very quick example, when Islamic State was just coming up in 2013, 2014 as a brand of terror and a brand of as a terror group. At that point of time as well, while they had just started taking territory in northern Iraq, social media was abuzz, and with these sort of pro-Islamic State accounts. We used to have this account called Shami Witness, I remember. And I personally used to have conversations with this guy because Twitter was just not interested or hadn't recognized at that point of time that what is actually taking place on their platform. So, the co-opting of course, technology, as Ambassador Reddy has so well already explained, we find ourselves very often just 2 steps behind to whatever we are planning to do as a policy reaction to these things. While we are now talking about how social media platforms need to actually clamp down on these groups. So now finally we know that Facebook, Twitter, Telegram have cleaned out a lot of pro-Islamic State accounts over the past 1 year or so. But since then, Islamic State has of course moved to other channels, which they're distributing propaganda as they used to earlier. It's just that the platforms have changed. Let's just to give a very quick example of how well it's orchestrated from the other side, and it makes it really difficult for a state or a policy response to these things. Right now, of course, Islamic State, for example, is on a very low guard in the Middle East, but they're doing fairly well by co-opting smaller insurgencies in Africa. And you sort of giving them their brand, which automatically sort of amplifies these smaller groups into the international and national stages. Uh, uh, all the African attacks that are taking place as part of the Islamic State outreach are distributed in English, French, Hindi, Tamil, Malayali, and all these languages pretty freely, even right now on a platform like Telegram. So it's not necessary that you need to go, let's say, to the dark web or 8chan and all these sort of Gab and all these newer sort of technologies. But even with the current technologies and big platforms, mind you, these are Telegram is of course a significantly large ecosystem, uh, and even these platforms are struggling to control this kind of information on their products, because even if they have a response, a technology based response, so do these terror groups now. They have co-opted it so well over the past couple of years that they have a response to a response from companies, from governments, or from platforms. So that's something that we are seeing when we're talking about the battle of narratives or creating narratives. I personally feel it's a bit harsh to say maybe, but I do personally feel we have lost that battle a little bit at this point of time. We are significantly slower in countering these narratives than they are being created at right now. How we are going to win it, I'm not particularly sure. If you see how state structures are generally constructed, their responses on a technology front, there have to be some other mechanism that have to be brought in if you actually want to even have a fleeting chance of winning a battle of narrative, right? So I mean, you cannot police what everyone is looking on their phone or what everyone is looking on their computers, because as if you go to these technology firms, they'll tell you these are, then the whole FOE things comes into play, and so on and so forth. But these are the ways groups, transnational groups such as Islamic State and Al Qaeda, have managed to create their ecosystems. Now, we can, of course, argue from an Indian perspective that we haven't had a lot of Islamic State cases in India, thankfully. They have failed miserably, even in their propaganda outreach here. I know that they have tried to build ecosystem here using Facebook and all these kind of things, but on the ground, they've never succeeded. But there are a lot of takeaways even from that ideologically of what kind of radicalization was sort of uh, taking place here. Like, for example, there are a couple of cases where an individual who was trying to be sort of pulled into the ISIS ecosystem, an Indian individual, lost interest halfway through when when the person realized that his dream to actually travel to the caliphate and live there as part of a ecosystem that he was attracted to was not going to happen because of finances, getting passports, just the whole task of traveling. Slowly they just got out of it by themselves. So actually no one did anything, right? So the whole act of trying to radicalize someone or like automatically just sort of fizzled out because there were other hurdles that this person had, which is finance, of course, how to get a ticket, how to get a passport, so on and so forth. So when we're talking about the battle of narratives, I think it's something uh, that really requires a lot of capacity building at this point of time, specifically in India, which is not happening, and we are sort of slowly losing that battle. And moving on from that, when we are talking of something like, let's say, de-radicalization, which has become this very popular and fancy word that we keep on hearing on all these, especially in the West right now. It's even if you see it from a perspective of big programs in the UK, for example, or in Germany, for example, they are all very loosely built and loosely implemented for something that is for a task that is very difficult of trying to wield someone off a radicalized thinking, and then taking them off that track by giving them a job or giving them financial stability is a very loose way of going about it. And I've seen this while doing my fieldwork in Maharashtra, for example, where there are uh, interestingly there are two problems which face a de-radicalization program in a state like Maharashtra. First and foremost, in my opinion, is that it is run by the counterterrorism ecosystem. I think that's quite counterproductive to begin with. And the second one is that it's just there is not enough, you know, I mean, there is not enough backing from the state or the center or the ecos or the security establishment at the back to actually see this as something worthwhile or as something worthwhile to do. So when you ask someone, can you give me a blueprint of what XYZ state's de-radicalization program is? You get a very vague sort of, yes, we give them a job, then after 10 days, someone will go and see how they're doing and so on and so forth. And you know discussions on issues such as reductivity rates and fallback rates and how are you calculating these, how are you following these, don't have any clear sort of subsets or answers if you are claiming, let's say 500 people were radicalized between X month and Y month, how are you coming to that conclusion? What is the definition of a de-radicalized individual? When do you say to someone, okay, now you are de-radicalized, or this person is de-radicalized? So these are some of just some of the uh, uh, issues that I thought I would just add beyond. I know we are pressed for time. I'll just take 2 more minutes beyond what has already been said. But I do believe that transnational terror and the threats that transnational terror poses, as how radicalization works, how distribution of propaganda works, and how well it is done by groups such as the so-called Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, and so on and so forth, is being slowly co-opted by other regional groups and smaller groups as well, because technology has become cheap to use. We saw recently, last week, the Taliban attacking, Afghan posts using crude drones, which was first used in 2016-17 in Syria by the Islamic State. And what are they doing? They're just using quadcopters that are available at Hamleys in a mall in anywhere you go, attaching crude bombs to them and just using them as weapons. So it will become, it's become very liberalized of how these tactics are traveling between these groups now. And we don't have any answers to this yet. Of course, we can talk about legalities, we can talk about international infrastructure of how we are going to counter terrorism in a very sort of kinetic manner. But I think strategic debates are going much faster now than they used to just 8 to 10 years ago, to what the threat perceptions are going to be. By the time we are thinking what the threat perception is, the perception is usually moving on, thanks to the co-option of technologies by these groups. I remember someone just asked me a very interesting question and very simple question, which I didn't have an answer to, is if an Islamic State group is committing an attack in Mali, why is there an entire channel on Telegram, giving all the details in Hindi? Who's reading this? And the answer could be, no one. But they do have the capacity, even if no one is reading it, or even if two to three people read it, they do have the capacity to actually get this information out in multiple languages, in multiple formats. And there are very few answers to these right now, whether it be from the tech platforms who you keep hearing, we've cleared this out, we've cleared that out, but you keep seeing this coming up in one way or the other. And of course, Telegram, we can keep talking about Telegram, but it's a big organization. There are many smaller technological platforms run by one person, two-person, or three-person who may not have the capacity to actually, deal with these kind of situations. So, so what these transnational groups are teaching us at the moment. I do believe that we, at least in India, in the Indian sort of theater, are not uh, uh, taking them to the chin yet. The kind of strategies that these groups are employing, the kind of strategies on radicalization they are employing, and how to distribute their agendas is something that we really need to stress upon in the coming time. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Kabir. I think, this aspect of transnational terrorism, you're right. I think it doesn't occupy enough of our attention, and most of the focus is on, the internal sort of conflict groups. So thank you very much for your insights. Gaurav, we can now, take questions. So do you have anybody who's raised his hand?
So we don't have anyone yet who's raised their hand, but we do have a couple of questions in the Q&A box. So if you want to pick some from there.
Okay, so I have two questions from Komal, and I'll take that to Mr. Jayanta Chaudhary. And the questions are, and they're sort of related. So the first part of the question is it only by making laws that terrorism can be controlled? And the second part is, in India, there are a number of laws, but even then, many more cases of terrorism come in front of us. So, I think the point Komal is trying to make is that the only aspect, obviously. And despite the laws, we are still having cases. So, are there any suggestions or your views or thoughts on this?
Interesting questions. The first is the option of law is not having a law. Now, the whole general when the General Huda started the talk, he talked about states based on rule of law, and that's the legitimacy of a state. Now, a law, you may consider the law to be an ass, you may consider it to be oppressive, but without a legal framework, I don't think a modern society can address very many issues. So I think I think every society, legitimate society, does have a legal framework with which to operate. Otherwise, it becomes the rule of the jungle. I mean, you just have force versus force, and as we had talked about, when you bypass the legal framework, then you get extrajudicial actions which are unacceptable. Is that all right, General? Does that answer the question adequately?
Yeah. So there is a question from, Avinash Paliwal. Uh, it's a bit tricky, in the context of today, but let me just, since Avinash has asked this, he says, how does the current political situation within India, rise of Hindu nationalism, help or hinder India's CT strategy? So I'll just repeat the question. How does the current political situation within India, rise of Hindu nationalism, help or hinder India's CT strategy? And if any of the panelists would like to take it on, could you? Or I will then nominate somebody.
Fine. Would you like me to take it up, General, or would you like to answer?
Yeah, please. No, please.
Well, it's like this. You see, every terrorist movement has had a motivation. For example, if you look at the LWE, it's socio-economic motivation. If you look at the Northeast, it's ethnic motivations. So there is always a causal factor. Maybe right, maybe wrong, but it's the perception that acts as the trigger. When I can tell you in Assam, the experience in Assam was that there was an agitation in the late 70s. It started from 79 against illegal migration. And at that time, the government of India used a very strong hand to suppress the agitation. It was a social agitation, mass agitation. What happened was that certain youth felt that they had no other option, and they crossed the border into Myanmar, and they got trained by the Myanmarese insurgent groups over there, and then they came back and took up arms. Now, the other thing is, of course, that later on, many of these youth returned to the mainstream. So yes, that's why we call them misguided youth. There will be those who, because of a certain situation, feel that they have no other option, and especially when they're young and their beliefs are unformed, they could get attracted to the use of violence as the only means of securing what they believe access to social justice. Am I vague enough, General?
Yeah, I think that, yeah. Let me just, related to this, also, raise one question on what do you do with extremist, content? And ma'am, this is for you. I mean, how do you deal with extremist content? It's all very well to say that, we can get Twitter and we can get Facebook, to deal with this. The problem is sometimes it is felt that, even their sort of censoring systems or what they retain or take down are based on their own ideologies, based on their own ideas of, liberal free speech. Uh, for example, with Trump's accounts being blocked, there are views on both sides that it should have been done or should not have been done. So how actually do you deal with, any suggestions on how we can deal with extremist content on the social media?
In fact, I'm glad you raised that because I did want to address that. Privacy is a major issue in cooperation with social media platforms. Users are obviously unwilling to have their details or their content shared with law enforcement agencies, even to combat terrorism. The anonymity is very important to the users of social media platforms. Social media's companies, on the other hand, are worried about losing a business. And you recall the famous Apple FBI confrontation when FBI wanted them to open somebody's uh, phone and they wouldn't agree. And there was finally a court decision. But in the meantime, FBI claimed that they'd been able to open it on their own. There are very cumbersome, what we call mutual legal assistance treaties systems. So if it's an international platform, you would have to go to the country where the company is from to ask for the details. And if we want the access to the identity of the user or access or the content, um, again, the MLAT system is not working very well. The regulation of social media, yes, there is self-regulation, and there is the question of should there be external regulation. In spite of the resistance from the social media platforms and the users, I think sooner or later there will have to be a very serious discussion on how governments and law enforcement agencies can cooperate with social media platforms. It is not that they will not agree to cooperate at all. Where the government makes a request, they do in fact consider it very carefully, and if it doesn't contradict their own company policy, they would come back and cooperate in certain cases. um, we've had instances of Facebook, Twitter, and WhatsApp who have cooperated in the past when the situation has been a little tricky. The special problem in India is, of course, that there's a very real risk of violence or incitement to violence to be spread through social media or even through a very simple system like an SMS. So far, we've been dealing with it by internet shutdowns, which I don't think is a good procedure in the long run because it raises questions on the freedom of expression, access. The furor there's been about the shutdown of internet for so many months in J&K, for example. But that is the measure that is being used. My suggestion would be that while I agree with Kabir that we have somewhat lost this battle on social media and it'll be very difficult to regain that ground, we should also think about using social media for pushing the counter narratives that I talked about, and work out a system by which you work with social media platforms rather than attacking them. And finally, I would really ask, why is it that we are not building good social media platforms in India? If Telegram and Signal can emerge as alternatives to WhatsApp, it's not rocket science. It's a fairly well-known technology. They all use the same technology. Why is an Indian company not coming forward to build an Indian platform, social media platform? So I'm actually going to end with this question. Thank you.
Yeah, ma'am, I think we need, the government needs to do, I think, a little more to encourage this. We are now on Zoom, frankly. And I know somebody is sitting in Bangalore who, who has an alternative to this, but I think just a reluctance to, sort of use the Indian platform. Let me take the next two questions. The first one to Kabir and the second to, Mr. Burma. So the first is, Harshada, who says, I believe terrorism is a form of psychological and ideological narrative. What kind of counter narrative can you provide that is consistent? So I'll take this to Kabir. I'll also, bring out the second question. And that is by Akshat. We are witnessing a rising movement related to Khalistan, and Canada government is not doing anything. It seems it is helping Khalistan. So how can the Indian government cooperate with other countries? So basically, the question is, cooperation and international kind of cooperation with other countries, and specifically quoting the case of Khalistan in this case. So, Kabir, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I'll just take the first question. There's no sort of, there's no, at least, I mean, there's not been any one way of doing counter narratives or building narratives, right? And they will never be. Every situation would demand a very robust and designed sort of pushback against whatever you are, whatever kind of radicalization or whatever kind of narrative you want to push against. And there have been some successes, there have been failures, totally depends on, some of the successes are literally individual cases and not necessarily against a movement and so on and so forth. So I think as far as, building narratives is concerned, maybe if we don't have, let's say, high expectations in the sense that, Facebook is going to come with something next week that will solve all problematic content, and we'll be able to sort of fight back against someone who has posted something in favor of Islamic State, and then we have something immediately that comes in, and they will read it or they will consume it, and it'll be sort of done. I think there is a missing discussion within the framework of talking about counter narratives online, that there needs to be an offline aspect to it as well, whether that be family, whether that be friends, whether that be whatever. But everything and anything just doesn't live online, right? There's a gap between, there's a travel gap between online and offline, where these counter narratives need to be placed, in my opinion. It's not necessarily just on the platforms, but between consuming something and then you planning to either talk to someone about it or spread it or act on it, there is that time, that lag in the middle is where this counter narrative needs to come. And that may sound easy, but that may be the hardest thing to actually do.
Yeah, thanks, Kabir. Well, I quite agree. I mean, to think that we can frame one common counter narrative, which will counter all ideologies, is not going to be possible. It'll be dependent completely on what the local conditions are, how it is to be transmitted. I mean, just look at J&K. A narrative that works in Kashmir is not going to work in Jammu. So to try and say that we can have sort of one sort of counter narrative to counter all kinds of ideologies, so based on local conditions. So thank you, Kabir. Mr. Verma, can I ask you to take on the next question?
It's a difficult one. I would much rather have a jab at what Jayanto fielded, but with Hindutva, probably easier to answer. Let me say this.
No, we'll get your views on that too after you finish this.
On this one, I think it was coming. I think anybody who's been looking at the way Pakistanis have gone into a defensive mode, the kind of pressures that the Pakistanis are beginning to feel internationally, whether it is the economic side, whether the FATF, whether it's internal disturbances, whether it is a general crunch on the economy, and the kind of profile India is beginning to build in the international global platforms and scenarios, something was to be brought out. There is a disgruntled set of elements floating around in this world. I don't think there are very many, thank God for that. And I think most of that community is very well conscious about the fact of patriotism and nationalism. And I don't think they're going to allow this to get out of hand. There are fringe elements which are there, which get fed and get regularly fueled by money, by radicalization, by all kinds of fake news, using social media platforms and all kinds of narratives that are being fed into their system. So some of this is expected, and I think the big brother, which is our northern neighbor, must be also having his hands in it. I wouldn't be surprised at all if there is a collusion in this kind of a thing, that you bring it out into platforms, be able to use the technology that they have got, which is very good, to be able to facilitate this kind of narrative floating around in the world and create some kind of dissonance and disturbance and trouble for India in this part. Canada specifically, the question was asked is, I think for some reason, I don't really want to say something which might be construed as interfering in their internal affairs. But what is happening is that looks like the party in power, the Prime Minister, is really looking at a constituency, which has been sort of leaning towards this extremist cause, which is actually, I think, had gone into obsolescence, and somehow they're trying to rake it up. And I think it's really, he's playing it for only a domestic audience. The trouble in these kind of things is that sometimes it gets out of control, and this begins to go outside the borders and begins to affect relations with another country. And I think they are well aware of this. It's probably not being curbed as quickly as it should be, and I'm sure they will, is because there's a possibility. It is a minority government, is there with a coalition. The coalition partner belongs to a lot of people who are sympathizers to this cause. So there is this movement, and they're probably going into an election very soon, where he might even have, governments might change, and the whole thing might again go back, and this problem might go away from Canada. But there was some social media clips that were floating around about a procession in New York, and so there are these chaps. They are able to do it. I was in Washington. I was posted there. We used to have them on particular days. They were there outside the embassy. They would come there. A lot of them we actually spoke to, and they said, we've been given X amount of money or Y amount of money. We are here for 10 minutes. Please don't do anything. We have to do this. We have to earn a living. We don't have any other jobs. So there are that kind of element which is also being done. But having said that, it's an important thing that has happened, and I think there is a need to watch this very closely and make sure that it does not go out of control. There are always people who might take advantage of this and create disturbances and law and order incidents. But the feeling I get, at least, and this is based on just observation and media and reports that are coming in, it's supported by a very minority section of people, and this is just only to stoke some trouble. So I think we are safe, we are all right. I don't think this problem is going to go out and get into the proportions that people might wish it to go. On the other question, General, if I might just take half a minute, is that that narrative is that's a philosophy. It's and what we are seeing is that this extremism is coming more out of radicalization of religion. So there are two differences in this, a very stark difference in this kind of a feeling. So I don't think that is really going to cause much of a pushback. But of course, there are people who feel that there might be an overwhelming leaning towards a particular philosophy or a way of life that is being enunciated or espoused by people. But I think this country is strong enough and really secularly oriented to be able to defend themselves against this kind of streaks of and fringe elements which are going to try and somehow disrupt its move towards getting into a big power, or at least move beyond just a South Asian power to a regional power and beyond. There are going to be disruptions. We are going to be facing these kind of things. The idea is to how to strengthen our own systems, whether it is technologies, whether it is intelligence. And that is something that I would also like to say, if you allow me to just go back for half a second, is that I think we need a lot more dependence on technology and intelligence to be able to take care of a lot of this, rather than putting our people out there in front and into physical harm and to be to be targets of attacks. I think a lot more needs to go into technology. A lot of money and resources needs to be put into those areas to actually develop a very effective counter-terrorism strategy. That's one point I wanted to make. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think one more, this kind of narrative of political dominance by one group or the other. I think there is also a need to strengthen our institutions, because at the end of the day, the common man, the common citizen is going to fall back on the institutions, to provide him, that kind of support that is required. So Gaurav, I think we are 1 minute beyond time.
Yes, sir. I think, yeah, so I think we should end now. I think this is, we are on time. So on behalf of everyone at CSD, I'd like to thank, first of all the panelists. This was an excellent, enriching discussion. So many aspects were covered. When we were preparing the concept note for this, we didn't envision all the different elements that were brought in by everybody. So thank you so much to all the panelists. And it came together very well. And Lieutenant General Huda for chairing this and steering it and asking the right questions at the right moments. I must also thank all of the participants for their questions, and everyone else who took time from their busy schedules and joined in for this very important discussion. To know more about what we do, you can check out our website, csdronline.org, and you can also keep yourself updated on more such events by following us on Twitter. We have the handle CSDR_India. So thank you so much once again, all the panelists, all the participants, and have a good night.